Chapter 18 The Great Selkie. Nowhere at sea. That was what Jarl Corby had said, and that was why Robbie turned his back on the Voe when he walked away with Finlearson's hand on his shoulder. Nowhere on land, Jarl Corby had said, and so Robbie did not continue walking inland. Instead, he took Finlearson to the top of the cliffs, running west of the Voe, seeing his way by the light of the merry dancers, still flaring green overhead. For half a mile, then, he led the way over the closed, thick turf clothing the rock of the cliff tops, and this brought them to the point where the great hole opened suddenly in the turf-covered rock. The hole was deep, deeper than any eye could guess or tell. Its walls were sheer rock, and from somewhere at the foot of those steep rocky walls came the sound of water swishing and swirling about. Robbie halted at the top of the hole, and there he glanced around, fully expecting to see Jarl Corby coming towards him. To his utmost dismay, however, there was no Jarl Corby in sight, and not even the slightest hint of his presence. "We'll have to wait," he said desperately over his shoulder to Finlearson. "I can't tell you yet where the skin is." Finlearson gave not a word in answer to this. He simply turned Robbie towards himself, and that was the answer enough, for it was then Robbie realized that he was seeing at last the true face of Finn the magician. In mortal terror at the sight, he shrank as far back as he could. The face hovered over him, and it was not old or young, nor yet anything in between, but simply a shifting blur of features that changed with every nightmare moment of his stare at it. It was no face at all, in fact, and yet somehow it was still every face that had ever haunted his deepest fears and his darkest dreams. The eyes of the faceless face bore into his own, for they were the one thing about the nightmare that did not change. They were still the great dark eyes which had tried to trap him earlier that night, and he could feel them probing his mind again, forcing him somehow to give away his knowledge of the hiding place Jarl Corby had found for the great Selkie skin. In a shaking voice, Robbie began to speak of the place that was open to every eye and yet secret from all. "This great hole beside us," said he, "is more than a hole, for it was made by the action of the sea boring a tunnel deep underground through a crack in the rock of the cliffs. And your skin is in the tunnel that leads from the hole." Triumph flashed from the dark gaze holding him in its spell. The figure towering over him swung around towards the hole. It teetered at the edge, ready to plunge into the seawater that stuck and swirled far below, and as it swayed there, a black shape rose swiftly up from the concealing darkness of a ledge a few feet down the rocky wall of the hole. The shape became the form of a bird that called out with the croaking voice of a raven. A noise of great, dark wings flapping mingled with its cry. The wings beat furiously around the head of the figure, swaying on the edge of the hole. The figure cried out, a terrible cry of pain that was neither animal nor human. Then, with hands clapped to its eyes, it hurled helplessly into the depths below. The raven wheeled to flap in a circle around the place where Robbie stood. Shaken out of his wits by this turn of events, and hurriedly he threw himself flat on the ground. Trembling, he lay there hugging his head with his arms and not knowing what to expect next. But nothing happened. Nothing at all. And at last he ventured to raise his head again. At first he thought he was alone. The next instant, he realized there was someone standing over there. He rolled away from the someone, ready to jump up and run for dear life, but he was hardly on his feet before he realized it was Jarl Corby standing there. Anger seized him then, and recklessly he shouted, "Where were you a minute ago? You promised me you'd be here in time." "Where was I?" Jarl Corby echoed. "Where do you think I was, boy? You came asking for magic to help you. And it is not for nothing I am nicknamed Jarl Corby." Robbie backed a step, his mind spinning with thoughts of the mere writing in Jarl Corby's ancient book of spells and the raven that was flapped around the head of the fallen figure. "You," he whispered. You were that raven?" "Why not?" Jarl Corby asked coolly. There was no better way to take him by surprise, and no better way either to have my revenge on him. Robbie stared, still trying to take in the thought of Jarl Corby transformed to the shape of a raven. The cry, the terrible cry of pain rang in his mind again. His gaze shifted to the black mouth of the hole, and Jarl Corby chuckled a dry and whispery sound that was more like a cough than a chuckle. "You'll not see him coming back out of there," he remarked, "but you will be able to see him come out of the cave at the seaward end of the tunnel." Turning on his heel, with this, he strode briskly away from the hole. Robbie hesitated to follow, but curiosity drove him on, and at the very edge of the cliff, Jarl Corby halted to wait for him. "Watch there," said he, pointing downwards as Robbie drew level, "and wait for the next flash of the merry dancers." Robbie stared down to the white foam and steely shimmer of the water at the cliff foot. The merry dancers were still flickering over the sky, but their light was too faint to show him anything more than this. And impatiently, he looked up to wait for their next flash. "Keep your eyes down," Jarl Corby warned. There were a few moments of silence after that, and then suddenly the flash came. It was a brilliant one, too, lighting up sea and sky like a great green searchlight, and right in the searchlight's path across the water, they saw what they had been waiting for, the head of a great bull seal forging rapidly seawards. "There he goes!" Robbie shouted. "Aye, there he goes," Jarl Corby echoed. "But he'll go back to his own country a different creature from the one that came out of it." Robbie glanced up in wonder at the tall figure beside him. "Why did he cry out like that?" he asked. "What did you do to him?" Jarl Corby gave another of his dry, whispery chuckles. "A raven's beak is a powerful weapon," he said softly. "Powerful enough to blind a man, and that was the revenge I chose to have." Robbie felt a shiver of horror running over him. "But a selkie hunts with its eyes," he exclaimed. "And so you might as well have doomed him to starve to death." "Would that have been so bad?" Jarl Corby asked. "I don't know," Robbie admitted, "but it's cruel all the same." Jarl Corby shrugged. "The thought does you credit, I suppose," he said dryly. "But my revenge was neater than that. Much neater. I blinded him of only one eye, which means he will still be able to hunt the seas the way the selkie does, but never again will he be able to come ashore in the shape of a handsome young man. And so never again will he have the chance to hunt human quarry." Robbie's gaze went back to the great dark head traveling seawards. It was a neat revenge, he admitted to himself. Cruel, but neat. For certainly the great selkie would no longer be able to charm golden-haired girls like Elspeth when he could no longer be handsome in human form. The light on the water went out as Robbie stared. Jarl Corby turned him homewards, and that was the very last sight he had of the great Selkie. Or so it seemed at that time, at least, for he had no cause then to think otherwise. And it is the very last time you are to speak of him too, remember, Jarl Corby reminded him as they walked back along the cliffs. For if one word of my part in this gets out in Black Ness, Robbie Henderson, I'll know where it came from. And you've just seen how I take revenge on those who harm me. I know, said Robbie, shivering with remembered horror. You don't ever have to fear that I'll run foul of you. The way things turned out after that, however, there was never any danger of Robbie mentioning either his own or Jarl Corby's part in the whole business, for there was still nobody else who found anything mysterious about it. Indeed, so far as everyone else was concerned, the story was still a perfectly simple one, the sort of thing that could have happened anywhere, in fact. A stranger had come ashore to Black Ness, and then he had fallen in love with Elspeth Henderson. Then there had been a fight between him and Elspeth's young man, and the stranger had taken off in a huff. That was how everyone saw things when Finn Learson did not appear the next morning, and for many years afterwards, that was what everyone continued to believe. Peter and Janet Henderson never did learn the truth, in fact, since Jarl Corby outlived them both, and Robbie dared not speak out as long as he was alive. So the years went past with Elspeth and Nickel getting married and happily rearing a big family of children, while Robbie went off to the whaling and finally got command of his own ship at last. In between voyages, however, he always came back to the island, and there he got himself quite a name for the stories he told of his adventures at sea. Not everyone believed those stories, of course, for Robbie's imagination had not grown less with the years. And so when the death of Jarl Corby finally set him free at last to tell the story of Finn Learson, he was quite bothered to find that not everyone believed him either. A thing like that, said some, is just too strange to believe. And anyway, nobody can ever tell how much of Robbie Henderson's stories are true, and how much of them are made up. He's just like his old da on that, said other people. But Elspeth spoke up for him and told them, Robbie didn't make up the part about Finn Learson's look. I remember what it was like, and I remember the way I felt it drawing me to the shore of the Voe on that Apelia. I don't think he made up the part about the scuttler either, Nickel remarked. I remember how I fought Finn Learson that night, and how I seemed to have a power beyond my own strength. I remember, too, how that power seemed to go from me as soon as I was below high water mark. And Jarl Corby was a wizard, Robbie reminded everyone, which made them all pause to think again, since no one had any doubts at all on that score. There was one further thing that struck the people of Black Ness then. All of them had noticed a bull seal which haunted the Voe from time to time, a huge old fellow which had only one eye, and which had certainly never been known to come into the Voe before the night of Finn Learson's disappearance from the island. To some of them, at least, this seemed to prove something. Indeed, there were those who went as far as saying that the creature could be the great Selkie haunting the scene of his terrible revenge Jarl Corby had taken on him. And as for Robbie himself, of course, he was quite convinced this was the case. In spite of all this, however, there were still people who believed that Finn Learson had been no more than the young man he seemed to be, and so the argument went on, with these same people always claiming that Robbie was just telling the kind of story his old da used to tell, and that it would be foolish to think otherwise. So a great many more years went by, until Robbie himself was an old da, with grandchildren who had never heard of the Selkie folk until he spoke of them. Yet still, even after the passage of all these years, The one-eyed Selkie continued to appear in the Voe, and every now and then there would be some youngster who would come asking Robbie questions about it. To each and every one of these young folk, then, he told the stranger who came ashore exactly as that story has been recounted here, and it no longer bothered him if any of them said, "I don't believe that." Robbie could remember himself saying the very same thing the first time he had been told about the great Selkie. Also, he was more than old by that time. He was wise, very wise, and so he never tried to convince anyone against that person's will. Instead, he did exactly what his old Da would have done. He just laughed and went on with another story.